On the 26th of July, 2025, President Claudia Sheinbaum stood before the Mexican nation to commemorate 700 years since the founding of Tenochtitlán, the ancient Aztec capital. Her speech is powerful, poetic, moving even. But it's also historically inaccurate, politically opportunistic, and ideologically dangerous. Because behind the beautiful words lies a myth that seeks to rewrite the origins of Mexico, not as the heir to an intercontinental empire, not as the product of civilizational fusion, but as a linear continuation of a pre-Hispanic utopia violently shattered by the Spanish conquest. This video is not a denial of indigenous heritage. It is a defense of historical truth. Let's set the record straight. Let's begin with the central claim of Sheinbaum's speech, that Mexico existed before the arrival of the Spaniards.
México no nació con la llegada de los españoles. México nació mucho antes, con las grandes civilizaciones que florecieron estas benditas tierras. Los mayas, los zapotecas, los mixtecos, los purépechas, los mixtecos, todos los pueblos originarios. Tenochtitlán, por ello, fue y sigue siendo símbolo de ese México profundo.
This is categorically false. The Mexica, the people of Tenochtitlan, were not Mexicans, nor were the Zapotec, the Mayas, the Purépechas, or any other indigenous group. They were independent, rival polities. Many of them were enemies. There was no Mexico before 1519. What existed was a mosaic of cultures, many of which were conquered or oppressed or ritualistically sacrificed by the Mexica themselves. To claim that all of these communities were part of a single Mexican nation is to erase their differences and contradictions in favor of an abstract, modern, nationalist mythology. That is not honoring indigenous history, that is manipulating it.
Tenochtitlan fue mucho más que una ciudad majestuosa. Fue un símbolo de organización, de poder, de ciencia, de arte y de visión. Fue el centro de un mundo indígena que supo construir un modelo de civilización propio, en armonía con la tierra, con los astros, con sus dioses y diosas.
Tenochtitlan was indeed majestic. It was well-planned, complex, and awe-inspiring. But let's not fall into romanticism. It was also a militarized theocracy governed by ritual human sacrifice, imperial tribute, and a warrior caste system. This was not some ecological utopia in harmony with the stars and nature. It was an empire built on domination. And that empire had plenty of enemies. Enough to explain why 95% of Cortes's soldiers were indigenous allies. Let's be real here. 550 Spaniards couldn't bring down a whole-ass empire unless that empire was already riddled with internal contradictions. They did not see Cortes as a foreign invader. They saw him as an opportunity for liberation. As explained by political theorist Marcelo Gullo in Maoist terms, for many of these indigenous communities, life or death was the principal contradiction.
Por eso le fue fácil derrotarlo a Cortés, ¿verdad? Porque si no hubiese sido imposible, ¿está? Imposible. Cortés lo único que se da cuenta, porque era un tipo inteligente, de, como decía Mao Zedong, hay que leer el libro de Mao Zedong, la contradicción principal. Dice, ¿cuál era era maoísta. Dice, ¿cuál es la contradicción principal acá? Vida o muerte. Si estos muchachos, yo les digo que conmigo van a vivir, aunque yo los explote después, ¿qué van a decir? Marchamos con vos. ¿Está? Porque la contradicción principal es vida o muerte, no explotado, explotador. Después esa viene después. De esa me puedo liberar después, pero si estoy muerto, ¿de qué me voy a liberar? Entonces marcharon con él para terminar con la contradicción principal, pero es de pura lógica.
This is the heart of the issue. Mexico was not destroyed in 1521. It was born, not from Tenochtitlan, but from the political, legal, religious, and economic structures of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, founded by Hernán Cortés as a translatio imperi of the Mexica imperial apparatus, expanded and refined through the integration of countless indigenous nations. What emerged was not a colony, but a civilizational project, a synthesis, a mestizo society, one that included the Philippines, California, Cuba, and the Pacific, connected by the Galeón de Manila, the Manila Galleon, and the Universidad de Mexico, almost a century before the United States had a single university. This was the real Mexico, the one that gave birth to the modern nation.
En lugar de comprenderlo, decidieron aplastarlo. La caída de Tenochtitlan en 1521 no solo significó la destrucción de una ciudad, fue también el inicio de un largo proceso de colonización que buscó borrar todo rastro de lo indígena.
This is one of the most persistent lies of modern politics, that Spain came to erase indigenous peoples, destroy their cultures, burn their books, and impose ignorance. But the truth is that Spain did what no other empire had done. It granted legal rights to its conquered subjects. It quickly abolished indigenous slavery. It built universities, hospitals, and printing presses. It founded schools in Nahuatl, preserved dozens of indigenous languages, and created laws to protect native land rights and political autonomy. Let's not forget, it was the Escuela de Salamanca in the 16th century that birthed the very concept of universal human rights, centuries before the French or the British Enlightenment. It was the Spanish crown, not any post-colonial republic, that first recognized the human dignity of the native. For Sheinbaum, Cortés is the villain, the invader, the destroyer. But historical honesty demands a different perspective. Without Cortés, there would be no Mexico. No Spanish language, no mestizaje, no Virgen de Guadalupe, no constitution, no independence. Like it or not, Cortés is the founding father of the Mexican nation. And he was not some illiterate brute with a sword. He modeled himself on Alexander the Great. He read the classics, understood diplomacy, and built a political order that lasted over 300 years. If you want to tear down Cortés, you must also tear down Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Bolivar, and every nation forged in war. That's not historical justice. That's infantile idealism. Here's the painful truth. It was not Spain, but the post-independence republics that dismantled indigenous protections. Land privatization, forced monolingualism, liberal reforms that seized communal land. The old viceroyal protections were abolished in the name of progress and the instrumental reason of capitalist modernity. The republics that replaced the viceroyalty were often far more racist, far more exclusionary, and far less protective of the indigenous than the empire had ever been. And that's a fact. The historical record is crystal clear. Sheinbaum speaks of memory, of roots, of identity, but she frames all of this against the Spanish Empire, against the very empire that made Mexico possible. Yet she asks modern Spain, which is only a small shipwrecked fragment of the empire who only happened to keep the name, to apologize when the true epicenter and descendants of the empire are her ancestors. Well, not her ancestors, but Mexico's ancestors. Let's be clear. Hispanic civilization is not a threat to Mexican identity. It is its source of strength. It is the glue that binds the nations of Hispanic America, from Mexico to Peru, from Chile to the Philippines, along with the 60 million Hispanics within the belly of the beast. It respects indigenous difference. It preserves cultural uniqueness. But it also offers something the Aztec Empire never did: universal dignity, political unity, and shared civilization.
Tenochtitlán fue belleza en movimiento. Desde lo alto de sus templos, los sacerdotes hablaban con los dioses. Desde sus mercados, el bullicio del comercio unía pueblos lejanos. Desde sus canales, las canoas deslizaban vida entre las chinampas, jardines flotantes que proveían el alimento de cientos de miles. Era una ciudad de orden y arte, de poder y de poesía. Su arquitectura era exacta, como las estrellas, y su gente orgullosa. Todo tenía un propósito, una armonía: el maíz en los campos y en las chinampas, los códices en las manos de los sabios que guardaron la memoria, el guerrero que ofrecía su vida por mantener el equilibrio del universo. Insisto, la grandeza de Tenochtitlán no fue solo su fuerza y su belleza, sino su alma, el espíritu indómito de un pueblo que emergió de la nada para crearlo todo, que convirtió una isla inhóspita en un imperio, que amó tanto a sus dioses y a su tierra y a sus ancestros, que fue capaz de ofrecer su corazón para que el sol siguiera saliendo todos los días.
Now, no one denies the splendor of Tenochtitlan, but to mythologize it as a perfect, harmonious world destroyed by foreign evil is to fall into the trap of the Black Legend, a propaganda narrative invented by Mexico's enemies to justify their own imperialism. Tenochtitlan was magnificent, yes, but it wasn't paradise. And it certainly wasn't Mexico. The pathological fixation with Aztec nostalgia does nothing to unite the nation. It fragments it. Culturally, historically, politically. It invents an original Mexico that never existed and vilifies the hundreds of thousands of Tlaxcaltecas, Otomís, Cholultecas, Totonacas, Mixtecos, Texcocanos, Zapotecos, etc., who built the real foundations of the Mexican state, slandering them and their legacy still today as traitors to an Aztec empire who did absolutely nothing to earn their loyalty. The world is multipolar. The US empire is in crisis. It's time to grow the fuck up and move beyond this hippy-dippy Pachamama noble savage bullshit, okay? I think we're old enough to stop hearing fairy tales and to start thinking in proper civilizational terms beyond the petty resentment of bourgeois nationalist mythology. Stepping up and reconciling the complexities and contradictions of your own history is the true and revolutionary move. Perpetuating good guy versus bad guy Manichaeanism is the brain rot of a weak and colonized people with no vision outside empty moralism and victimization. To know who we are, we must know where we come from. Not from Aslan, not from myth, but from history. From Tenochtitlan, yes, but far more importantly, from New Spain, that integrated the hundreds of indigenous communities in Mexico. That is Mexico, a product of synthesis, of continuity within rupture, a mestizo nation built by war, law, love, and faith. To heal the past, we don't need more myths. We just need the truth. Because only by remembering who we really are can we build the future we deserve.